This was the site that met the first men to set foot in New Zealand. The people we now know as the Maoris had travelled thousands of miles in canoes across the Pacific from islands as far away as Tonga. The newcomers were confronted by an uninhabited paradise which was then, and still is, being attacked by forces from within the earth. The wildlife was completely strange to the new arrivals. The creatures still bear the names the Maoris gave them. Birds like the kia, an enormous parrot with a menacing beak, and its smaller relative, the kaka. The kereru, a giant version of our own wood pigeon. The tui, with its distinctive white throat feathers. And the blue wattled kokako. The first Maori to see a kiwi must have had quite a surprise. It's flightless and probes for insects like an anteater. Kiwis were soon to become prized for their flesh. The reptiles, too, are unique to these islands. The green gecko hunts by day. Most geckos are nocturnal. The tuatara is the only surviving relative of the dinosaurs. It was known from 150 million-year-old fossils long before a living specimen was discovered in New Zealand. It may look like a lizard, but the bone structure of its skull is far closer to that of the dinosaurs. The row of scales on the back of this youngster will develop into a short crest. It can live well over 100 years, and no lizard does that. What the Maoris didn't find was a single land mammal. 100 million years ago, the great land mass we call Gondwana land had begun to break up, eventually to take the form of the continents we know today. At that time, the age of mammals had not dawned. New Zealand broke away from Australia, taking only birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, and invertebrates with it. Today, New Zealand still lies at the junction of two of the Earth's shifting plates. Such areas are always highly volcanic. Rotorua in the North Island is one of the most active regions. Because of this, it was singled out by the Maoris as a sacred place. It's easy to see why the Maoris from their small Pacific islands were overawed by their new country. This land that steamed and bubbled was rich in forests. It had great lakes and a limitless supply of fresh water. The Maoris gave a name to this land that seemed to recreate itself out of the earth in steam and smoke. They called it the Mother Who Never Dies. Unfortunately, not everything recreated itself. The forests they thought of as endless quickly proved to be a finite resource. The Maoris brought with them a slash and burn system of agriculture, and huge areas of forest were put to the torch. In New Zealand's forests, a fire once started often proved impossible to control. Fire on such a scale was a new experience to these Pacific Islanders. Many of New Zealand's birds are flightless. Large numbers were destroyed in these fires. The Maoris also used fire as an aid to hunting. These huge feet belonged to the now extinct moa, a giant of a bird 12 feet high. For millions of years, the moa was the dominant life form on the islands. Fire was used to drive it out of its forest home and help to exterminate it. The arrival of Captain Cook was to mark an even greater change to the Mother Who Never Dies. It was the start of a long line of plant and animal introductions both deliberate and accidental, and most of them disastrous. The beautiful lake area of Rotorua in the North Island has suffered from its share of foreign introductions. As always, they've been at the expense of native flora and fauna. This innocent-looking plant is Elodea canadensis, or if you prefer it, Canadian pondweed. Introduced to New Zealand about 100 years ago, it has taken over lakes and rivers in a big way. A knock-on effect has been to attract foreign birds which like eating it. Originally, the nearest coots were in Australia, 900 miles away, but occasionally birds would arrive, perhaps blown off course by storms. It was in 1958 that the first coots bred here. Since then, their numbers have increased dramatically with the bumper crop of Elodea. There are now several thousand coots in North and South Islands, and Rotorua has more than its share of these new arrivals. In the favourable conditions on the lake, they raise several clutches a year, though this egg plainly isn't going to add to the population. The male seems to suspect the egg is infertile and ejects it from the nest. The coot got here under its own power. The black swan also originates in Australia, but it arrived here with man's help. It was deliberately introduced as a game bird in the middle of the last century. Swans and coots are notoriously quarrelsome birds, especially at nesting time and when they have young. Both species thrive by feeding on Elodea, and both have a high rate of breeding success at Rotorua. There's little doubt that their increase and the aggressiveness that goes with it are often at the expense of native water birds. As both swans and coots feed on Elodea, you could say that the explosion of both introduced species is largely due to the introduction of that foreign food plant. It's one more example of man tampering with the natural scheme of things in New Zealand. No one would deny that the black swan is an extremely handsome introduction, provided it doesn't become too successful. The cygnets, somewhat surprisingly, are the same colour as any other swan chick, pale grey. These have not long hatched. At this stage, they eat surface food. They have yet to master the art of upending. The reed beds surrounding Rotorua are the home of another of New Zealand's recent additions. The pukeko is a large, colourful rail, relative of the moorhen. In its native Australia, it's known as the swamp hen. The fact that it has a Maori name shows it's been here for some time. It's thought to have made its own way to these islands sometime in the last 200 years. Despite its heavy appearance, it flies well. The pukekos don't take too kindly to the coot invasion. Like coots, they nest in the reed beds. They're nervous birds and easily disturbed when they're sitting on eggs. As well as plant material, the pukeko feeds on insects, worms, and small fish. She's taking food back to the nest to feed her single offspring. One chick is unusual. Pukekos normally lay 4 to 7 eggs. The New Zealand dabchick is found nowhere else. Its nest, an untidy pile of rotting waterweed, is usually built in a secluded part of the reed bed. Dabchicks are found all over the world. The New Zealand species has bright yellow eyes and keen sight, which it uses to hunt aquatic insects and small fish. Both sexes share the job of incubating the eggs. This is a second clutch. The dabchick's mate is still busy with a chick from a batch of eggs which hatched about 3 weeks ago. By the time the second clutch hatches, this chick must be able to fend for itself. In the meantime, it's still happy to hitch a ride on its parent's back, although it's just about outgrown this particular form of transport. A family of scorp swims past as the chick struggles to stay on board. The black swan cygnets are now a fortnight old. They won't develop their black plumage until they're fledged at the age of 4 months or so. Even an adult black swan isn't completely black. The primary flight feathers are pure white, but they're only seen when the swan is flying. On Rotorua's lakes, birds are not the only creatures to have been introduced at the expense of the residents. The British introduced foreign species for 2 main reasons: to have familiar creatures around them and for sport. The rainbow trout, an American fish, falls into the latter category. Rainbow trout eggs were introduced into New Zealand rivers towards the end of the last century. Rainbows are famous for their fighting qualities. They're also prodigious predators. Many of the smaller native fish have declined since their introduction. Most of New Zealand's fish belong to a group called the galaxids. They're relatively small fish with large heads. Their skin is smooth, thick and leathery, and they have no scales. The banded kokopu is found throughout New Zealand and is still a Maori delicacy. It's one of the largest species of galaxids, reaching a length of about 8 inches from its snout to the end of its tail. The giant kokopu is the largest of the group. It can reach almost 2 feet in length and weigh up to 6 pounds. The smaller galaxids and fry of the larger species are collectively known as whitebait. They're caught and eaten in the same way. Some of these fish have evolved into bottom-living species. Their way of life and long cylindrical bodies are very similar to our own loaches, though these don't occur in New Zealand. One species, the Kaora, can even climb up waterfalls using its large pectoral fins. It's also known as elephant ears. The streamlined torrent fish is at home in fast-flowing rivers. New Zealand's native crayfish has come under pressure from 2 directions. Big rainbow trout find it a delicacy, and so do human gourmets. So now only the Maoris are allowed to catch it. They have special fishing rights. The long-finned eel is by far the biggest of the native fish, reaching almost 2 meters in length and weighing up to 45 pounds. Though the introduced rainbow will eat young eels, the adult is in no danger. It feeds on fish including trout and even birds. It takes up to 20 years to reach maturity. Then it begins its long journey to the spawning grounds somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. Perhaps the weirdest introduction around Rotorua is the Australian bell frog. Schools needed tadpoles for biology lessons. The native frogs skip the tadpole stage and lay eggs that develop on land. So the bell frog was introduced for educational purposes. But neither the frogs nor the fish would survive here at Sulphur Bay on Lake Rotorua's southern shore. Because of volcanic activity, the water is warm, murky, sulphurous, and low in oxygen. But the islands, surprisingly, do have their attractions for wildlife. They're isolated and inhospitable, which means that no one bothers to go there, and this suits the black swan. The swans normally breed in the lake's reed beds. Here there's a colony. The nests are thick on the ground to use all available space, but just out of pecking range of the nearest neighbor. On the aptly named Sulphur Point nearby, there are two more nesting colonies. They're occupied by two species of Rotorua's gulls. The red-billed gull is a small, delicate-looking bird confined to the temperate zones of the southern hemisphere. Large numbers nest together on the volcanic rocks around the lake's edge. The nest is just a shallow saucer of dead grass. The rocks are hot to the touch. Nesting birds cool themselves by panting. Some of the gulls nest in what can only be described as an avian sauna, with hot steam swirling from nearby volcanic vents. At least the island is secure from predators, but there is a price to pay. The sulphurous water eats away the gulls' feet. By the end of the nesting season, many are webless. A little way away on the same volcanic island nests another species very similar in size and appearance. It's the closely related black-billed gull. In fact, it's so close that the two species occasionally interbreed. You can identify it at once by its black bill and dark eye ring, and its nest, which in contrast is deep and well-shaped. The black-billed gull has had its troubles in the past. The early Maori settlers ate it regularly. If they raided this colony for food, both flesh and eggs must have had a richly sulphurous taste. Today, neither of these elegant gull species is in any danger. A continual stream of adults flies in with food for their young. They'll eat almost anything, small fish, insects, and scraps from Rotorua's town rubbish dumps. These chicks are almost ready to fly down to the coast with the adults. The pickings round Sulphur Point are meagre even for wading birds like the pied stilt. The water supports little life. But the gulls manage to churn up small organisms from the lake bed by paddling with their webless feet. High above Lake Rotorua, on Mount Tarawera, the landscape has been changed by a third gull species. This brownish grass only grows here on what was once bare volcanic soil. The grass is nourished by the tons of guano deposited by the Dominican gulls. The Dominicans find their food in the lakes far below and around Rotorua's rubbish tips, and fly back to the hill to feed their chicks hiding in the dense grass. The huge increase in the Dominican gulls in recent years seems to be a result of scavenging around rubbish heaps, sewage works and sheep stations at lambing time. No one can deny what the Dominicans have done for what was once a bare, rocky landscape. Their guano has clothed it in grasses that would never otherwise have gained a foothold. The Dominican gull is not the only bird that has benefited at the hand of man. Like all its kind, the little shag is almost exclusively a fish eater. The introduced rainbow trout may have diminished the native fish species, but the shags have certainly had their share of rainbow trout. Many of the shags nest in tall trees that line the cliffs around Okere Falls. Here the overflow from the lakes begins its journey down to the sea. It's the end of the nesting season. Many of the untidy stick-built nests have already been vacated by fully grown chicks. The adults, they're the birds with the distinctive white throats, will soon cease to bring food to their young. An empty stomach is the best incentive in the world to persuade the young birds to hunt for themselves. And anyway, large webbed feet may be ideal for swimming, but they make life a little difficult in trees. The little shags aren't dependent on the native trees for their nest sites. They can nest almost anywhere. But much of New Zealand's wildlife is found only in the native bush and forests. And as we shall see, that's an environment that is shrinking almost daily. New Zealand was completely isolated for at least 100 million years. In that time, it not only evolved some unique creatures, much of its plant life is unique too. Until the British introduced deer in the last century, there were no plant-eating mammals. So vegetation had the maximum opportunity to evolve species special to the island. Most of New Zealand was once covered by dense forests. Long before the Maoris started to burn the woodlands, many of the forests had had a long history of devastation and regrowth. Volcanic action was often the cause. One of the areas that suffered most was Rotorua. Rotorua lies within a gigantic volcanic depression. It has been shaped and reshaped by frequent violent eruptions. The most recent was just over 100 years ago when Mount Tarawera blew its top. The eruptions began shortly after midnight on 10th of June 1886. By 6 in the morning, it was all over. In those few hours, a huge area around Tarawera was destroyed. 150 people died. 3 villages were buried. The camera was then in its infancy. Nevertheless, an amazing series of photographs was taken just after the event. These early pictures show how large areas of forest were destroyed, their trees and shrubs smothered by volcanic ash. Some trees were torn apart by the fierce winds that accompany such eruptions. All life was killed in the beautiful Rotorua lakes. Several feet of ash that quickly turned to thick mud buried people's homes. The Rotomahara Hotel wasn't exactly 4-star to begin with. Now it was a complete wreck. Under this sea of mud, 3 villages along the lake shore lay buried. The disaster completely altered the landscape. New lakes soon formed in the craters caused by the eruption. huge gash that ran the length of Mount Tarawera had been created. Today, over 100 years later, the scene hasn't changed very much. The chasm, formed when thousands of tons of rock were blasted to powder and hurled into the atmosphere, still lies bare and lifeless. In the sheltered lowlands, the forests recovered, as they had no doubt recovered many times before. But now they face a new threat. Large areas are being cleared either for farmland or for replanting with alien softwoods for New Zealand's timber industry. Once the large native trees have been felled and removed, the undergrowth is quickly and effectively destroyed by napalm. The destruction isn't quite as wanton as it looks. The woodland is privately owned. Before it can be felled and burnt, the forestry department must give permission. If rare wildlife is likely to be endangered, it must first be captured and moved to a safe area of native forest. This applies particularly to the flightless birds. However well supervised these clearing operations may be, it's hard not to give a shudder when you see the smoke pall in the sky. It is native woodland that is going up in smoke, to be replaced by Pinus radiata, a foreigner from California. Commercial necessity rules, and radiata is a valuable commercial crop. Pinus radiata is the ideal cash crop. The little pines are planted among the ashes of the old forest. They're perfectly suited to New Zealand's climate. They transplant easily and need very little attention afterwards, apart from thinning the lower branches. They resist diseases and tolerate herbicides. Radiata matures and is ready to cut in 30 years. In other words, it is a forester's dream. Most conifer plantations are drably uniform, supporting little wildlife in their gloomy shade. Happily, radiata is an exception. It grows tall and straight with few lower branches. Sunlight penetrates, and the native bush quickly grows up beneath the trees. Tree ferns are found in many places throughout the world, but they're particularly abundant in New Zealand. They have remained unchanged since the age of the dinosaurs. Their long, fibrous trunks are made up of the bases of old leaves and can reach 50 or 60 feet in height. One this size is about 60 years old. Many ferns are ground-living. The new plants of the hen and chicken fern develop on the mature leaves and then fall off to take root. One species of tree fern has a special significance for New Zealanders. It's their national emblem. When the Maoris moved through the thick forests at night, they marked their trail by turning over the leaves of the silver fern so that the shining underside reflected the moonlight. One of the native trees that finds a home among the radiata is the manuka, or tea tree. This one is home to an amazing spider that builds its nest in the uppermost branches. It looks like a web, and it's made of the same material. Its purpose isn't to catch food, but to rear the spider's young. It's a nursery, or perhaps greenhouse would be an apter description. The web is spun so densely that during the day it acts like glass and concentrates the sun's rays. The eggs are incubated in this greenhouse atmosphere. The female remains in close attendance when her offspring are ready to hatch. hundreds of tiny spiders, each one smaller than a pinhead, jostle around inside the protective cocoon. They wait for night before they leave the nest and disperse. Many will fall prey to birds, lizards, insects and other spiders, but overproduction in the greenhouse web ensures that enough will survive. Wherever they went, pioneer British settlers liked to see something that reminded them of home. Without any regard for their new environment, they brought with them familiar creatures, especially birds. This song thrush is a descendant of birds brought out on sailing ships in the 1870s by the Acclimatization Society. Many of the imported birds died on the voyage or shortly after, but the song thrush survived and finds the undercover of the radiata plantations excellent for nesting. The blackbird was another of the successful introductions. Today, such importations are banned throughout the world. Aliens often thrive at the expense of native species. The chaffinch, too, has moved into the radiata forests. It has moved in everywhere else, too. It's easy to see why the Acclimatization Society put the chaffinch on their passenger list. Its bright colors and attractive song were as good as a letter from home. The foreign birds don't have it all their own way in the plantations. This curious structure among the manuka trees is the nest of the grey warbler. Its Maori name is Riro Riro. It's a native bird with close relatives in Australia. Its pear-shaped nest is built largely from moss. It looks insecure, but the sides are firmly anchored to the branches. The fantail, another native species, nests close by. It's a restless little bird, familiar to all New Zealanders. The chicks are almost fledged and nearly overflowing the sides of the nest. The fantail never seems to stop moving about as it searches for insects. The nest, which is made of dried grass and leaves, is woven around a living branch. There are other residents. It's crawling with tiny mites. In a week or so, the chicks will be ready to leave. The fantail is a prolific breeder. 5 broods a summer is not unusual. Many thousand insects will have been caught to feed all those young. But it's the dense native forest and bush that harbours most of New Zealand's native and unique wildlife. And that habitat is forever dwindling. Here the trees stand festooned with epiphytes, bromeliads and ferns, just the way the Maoris first saw them when they landed here. In the more open areas, green geckos hunt among the ferns for insects. Geckos are normally nocturnal lizards, but these are daytime hunters. The native geckos are unique in another way. They're the only geckos in the world to give birth to live young. The camouflage of the closely related forest gecko reveals where it spends most of its time, on trunks and branches. The dense podocarp forests are also home to a variety of birds unique to New Zealand. Podocarps are a group of evergreen shrubs and trees to which many of the large native species belong. This is where you find, or perhaps hear, the bellbird, said to have the most beautiful song of any bird in these islands. Although once common over a wide area, the red-crowned parakeet has suffered in numbers as the native forests have come down. The moorpork is the sole surviving native owl. It's unusual because it feeds by day as well as by night. The tui looks like a starling, but its large size and distinctive white throat feathers soon identify it. The first sign of this bird's presence is the harsh, rattling screech that it uses to keep in touch with the rest of the group. It's the kaka, a large, somber-coloured parrot. Like the parakeet, its numbers have dropped dramatically with the felling of the native trees that also eliminated the flowers and fruits on which it feeds. It uses that fearsome-looking beak for tearing open bark in search of grubs and insects. The weka is a highly predatory flightless bird. It's ground-living and the size of a small chicken. It feeds on just about anything, both plant and animal. Though flightless, it still possesses small, rounded wings. After millions of years of flightlessness, one group of birds has lost almost all trace of wings. They're probably New Zealand's most famous symbol. In fact, many people think of them rather than the silver fern as New Zealand's emblem. The kiwi is the last survivor of a large group of flightless birds that included the extinct moa, its close relative. There are 3 species of kiwi. It's the only bird in the world to feed by smell, probing the ground for earthworms with its long beak. It excavates its own burrow, often under a fallen log. In proportion to its own size, it lays the biggest egg in the world. It's a quarter of the female's body weight. After laying such a huge egg, she lets her mate do the incubating, a job that can last 75 days. The kiwi's feathers lack the barbs of normal feathers, so the bird appears to be covered by dense hair. Its skin was prized by Maori chiefs who made it into cloaks. Kiwi skins were even exported to Europe to make feather muffs for ladies of fashion. The powerful feet and claws are used for digging and defense. The kiwi has another unique feature, nostrils on the end of its long bill. It uses them for sniffing out giant earthworms. The kiwi has filled a niche that would normally be occupied by a mammal such as a shrew or a hedgehog. With no competition from mammals, it has survived for millions of years. Sadly, some of New Zealand's birds that have thrived and evolved in their splendid isolation were exterminated shortly after man arrived here. The huia, like the kiwi, was unique among the world's birds. It was the only species in which the male and female had completely differently shaped bills. The female's was long and curved for winkling out grubs and insects from trees. The male's was shorter and thicker for breaking open bark and rotten wood. They were a team and were only seen feeding in pairs. At the turn of the century, the then Duke of York was presented with a huia tail feather, which he promptly stuck in his hat. That simple action, many people believe, led to the bird's extinction. The demand for huia feathers proved too great. The last huia was seen alive on the 28th of December, 1907. Another unique New Zealand bird, the kokako, a close relative of the huia, is declining for a different, but these days more common reason: destruction of habitat. These tiny pockets of native forest, separated by farmland, are each only big enough to support 1 or 2 pairs of these birds. When the trees are felled, there's often nowhere else for them to go. And even if there is, the kokako is such a poor flyer that it usually can't make the journey. Kokako are secretive and not frequently seen. The only clue to their presence is often their beautiful song. The kokako's short, rounded wings are only strong enough to carry it from one tree to the next. Sometimes it moves through the branches rather like a squirrel, hopping from twig to twig in search of leaves, berries, and the occasional insect. Pairs appear to mate for life, and they always stay within calling range of each other. This pair's forest is about to be cleared for farmland. The birds will have to be moved if they're going to survive. Kokakos are normally only active in the early morning, so the wardens from the Department of Conservation put up their nets the previous afternoon. The birds spend most of their time 60 feet up in the forest canopy, so that's where the nets have to go. Next morning, when the sun comes up, the birds start to call. Kokakos are very territorial. They react immediately to the sound of another kokako calling. But the intruder this time is a tape recorder. The hope is that its calls will lure the resident birds to take off in response and fly into the nets. The male does exactly that. He's lowered 50 feet to the ground to be disentangled unharmed from the mist net.
Get his feet out first. He flew in from this side, Geordie.
5 minutes later, the female fell for the same trick.
Just hold on to it. The legs will jab into you, but you have to just hold on to it like that. Yeah. That's the one.
The captives go into a bag to keep them calm. They'll be moved to a large enclosure. They'll stay there for about a fortnight until they've completely settled down before they're moved to a new and totally safe home.
What he doesn't get is hooks in here.
Their new haven is Little Barrier Island, off the east coast of the North Island. The island is a wildlife reserve, inhabited only by the warden and his family. There are no introduced predators on the island. The dozens of feral cats that once lived on Little Barrier have all been exterminated. Little Barrier Island is covered with dense native podocarp forest. Here the kokako and many other rare forest-living New Zealand species have the best possible chance of survival. The kokakos are released in pairs at various sites on the island so that they can establish their own territories. The release system is working well. The population numbers over 30 and the birds are breeding. New Zealand is about the same size as the United Kingdom, but in some ways the pressures on its wildlife are more severe than on our own. The unique forest species are particularly vulnerable. It seems certain that the only way these can survive is within carefully managed areas like Little Barrier Island. No one is more aware of these problems than the New Zealanders themselves. They've proved to be pioneers in many forms of conservation, and their wildlife services are the equal of anything in the world. But the pressures are going to continue to build up. Since man arrived on the scene in the last few hundred years, New Zealand wildlife and wilderness have faced the biggest threat in their long history. It's easy to see why the Maoris, who first viewed these forests, called the land that produced them, and so many other natural wonders, the mother who never dies. Now one can't help feeling that Earth Mother will need quite a bit of help if she's to remain fit and healthy, let alone if she's to live forever.